Good morning. Thanks for joining the webinar. We're going to allow a moment to get everybody on. Thanks to everybody coming in. Just a quick note that this webinar is being recorded and the recording and slides will be available on our website after the webinar. See lots of folks trickling in, so we'll just give it another moment or two. As folks are coming in, just a little bit of housekeeping. The webinar will be recorded. We will have slides available with the recording afterwards. And you can go ahead and put any questions that you have throughout in the Q&A function. And we're happy to answer those during, and we'll hopefully have some time for questions at the end too. Wonderful. Well, thanks for everybody who's joining this morning. This webinar that I'm co-hosting with my friend Daniel is all about advocacy in the early childhood space and using your big voice in your community. So we'll go ahead and move on to the first slide here. So a little bit about groundwork. I know a lot of the folks on the line are friends already and are quite familiar with us, but we are obviously a statewide nonprofit public policy research and advocacy organization. We formed in 2004, so we're celebrating our 20th anniversary this year, very excited. And we are all about using our voices to champion policies that are great for kids from prenatal to age 5 to really make Ohio the best place to raise a young child. And we focus primarily on statewide policy and work with folks like you from all over the state to really connect to decision makers and policymakers. Really encourage you, if you're not already following, our social media channels are very, very active. I think we're at Groundwork on Ohio on pretty much every social media channel that there is. Feel free, if you are active yourself on Twitter or LinkedIn or Instagram, to go ahead and engage with us today on social media and tag us if you're attending the webinar and you have ideas or feel inspiration as we're chatting this morning. So just a little bit of an agenda for the morning's conversation. First, we are going to define advocacy and what that means, because that's the end goal of all of these great things we're talking about today. We're going to talk specifically about how to engage with policymakers in your district. So we all know it's important to be at the Statehouse, but it's also really important to meet with folks in their own districts. We're going to talk about some opportunities Groundwork is putting together in the spring that you can use to engage with folks in the district. And Daniel is going to cover power mapping your own network and talk about social media engagement, engaging with traditional media as well. And an overall theme is really just how important it is to be an advocate 365 days a year. So just a little bit of background on us. I'm Brittany Bolton. I am Groundwork's new Managing Director of Advocacy and Engagement. I joined the team in January of this year. My background is really focused on Statehouse advocacy. I started as a staffer for the Senate Minority Leader in 2008. And since then, I've done some advocacy work in Illinois' General Assembly around enhancing parent and caregiver voice in the public school governance system. And I've also worked a lot in community development and housing. I've worked for a contract lobbying firm. I've also done some nonprofit fundraising and communications. In addition to my professional role, I'm a mom of 2 young children, ages 5 and 7, who've been through the daycare system and had really great childcare experiences here in Columbus that have made me feel passionate about this work. I've also locally been engaged as a Girl Scout troop leader and through our Clintonville Area Commission here in the neighborhood. So really love talking about grassroots advocacy opportunities. And I'll turn it over to my colleague Daniel to share more about his background.
Thanks, Brittany. Hello, everyone, and thanks for having me on and thanks for being here. My name is Daniel Van Hoogstraten. I live in Columbus, Ohio, and I work for a public affairs firm called Remington Road Group, based in Columbus. My background is primarily in press and communications. Years ago, it was in government and politics. Then I ran a statewide issue advocacy and political organization in Ohio and joined the firm a few years ago and have been really proud to be able to partner with and work with Groundwork Ohio for the last few years. So thanks for having me on. And I look forward to our webinar today.
Thanks, Daniel. We're thrilled to have you. And I am going to ask Daniel to talk a little bit, kind of some of this table setting around what advocacy is and why it's important. It might seem a little bit basic, but I think it's important for us to kind of have shared definitions and goals as we're endeavoring upon this conversation.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, as it says on the screen, it's an activity by an individual or group that aims to influence decisions within political, economic, or social systems and institutions. Also, child advocacy, I think folks on this call know that as well as anyone. When we're doing that, we're advocating for a group that can't speak for themselves in terms of advocating for themselves to local officials or the Statehouse or the governor's office, and a group that's all too often left behind. So it's just sort of like a reminder to redouble our efforts, and we have to work twice as hard because we're not representing people who can vote. Or who can donate money to political campaigns, or often who are listened to. So that is advocacy defined generally, and I think for us a bit more specifically as well. Absolutely.
And we all know that one of the key audiences as we're endeavoring upon this advocacy work is the state legislature. So just a quick note about using the legislature.ohio.gov website. If folks aren't familiar already, there is a button on the homepage called Who Represents Me. And if you click on that button and you put your street address in for either your home or your workplace or the place where you provide early childhood services, it will pop out your state senator as well as your state representative. And then from there, you can click on the link and it'll take you straight to their personal webpage on the ohiohouse.gov or ohiosenate.gov websites. At that point, you can email your legislator. Sometimes they have their social media tags there as well, and you can click on them. There should be a phone number for their office in Columbus. And you can check out their biographies and see, do they have children? Do they have a nexus to this work? What committees do they sit on? Are they in a leadership position? And really try to start figuring out what their ability to move legislation in the General Assembly might be, as well as what their connection to our mission is. It's also important to note that thanks to redistricting and term limits, these folks might change quite frequently. So you might check them out one summer, and then we have a General Assembly change, and we're coming into a new budget season, and it might be somebody completely different. So it's a good exercise to regularly visit this page throughout the General Assembly. I am not going to read this whole slide, but just a little bit more table setting around the elected officials at the Statehouse. General Assembly is a 2-year term. We're currently in the 135th General Assembly, and the legislative term limits are different for senators and representatives. Typically, there are about 3 House district seats in every state Senate seat. So that's helpful information to know as well. And just another quick reminder about term limits and folks that come through. Nailing down a little bit more specifically on the General Assembly timeline. In addition to being 2 years, there is a budget cycle, the operating budget cycle, every other year. So that's during odd numbered calendar years. So we're currently not in operating budget cycle. We will be next year. And this timeline shows you a little bit more month by month what it looks like coming into those seasons where all of those important funding decisions are made for every single program that touches our lives. So this summer, we know that the state agencies will begin submitting their budget considerations to the governor's office, and then Governor DeWine will be introducing his legacy budget early next calendar year. So the first thing that we wanted to cover today is, with this context in mind of the budget cycle coming up next year, this summer is such an important time for you to be meeting with your legislators in their community. The legislative sessions have been infrequent, to say the least. This spring, they've not been meeting very regularly. Not a ton of bills have been passed during the current General Assembly. Folks are in their district quite a bit. It's campaign season. This is a really good time to be meeting folks in the district. And we wanted to talk about 2 ways that are quite useful for meeting with legislators back home. So the first is kind of a standard in-district meeting. Why in district? What makes it valuable to meet with a legislator for coffee in your community versus near the Statehouse per se? Well, there are a couple different reasons. One of them is that legislators during any given General Assembly are meeting with dozens, if not hundreds of lobbyists on Cap Square. They have folks cycling in their office for 15 minutes all day long. And I myself have been a part of that cycle where they might not remember you if you don't hit it off right away or have an issue that's close and dear to their heart. If they meet you in the district and you meet at a local coffee shop that perhaps they frequent regularly, you're going to stick out in their head a little bit more than perhaps some of the folks during that kind of round robin of meetings, year or day over day, hour over hour on Cap Square. They also might be a little bit more comfortable speaking candidly in the district. If they're on Cap Square, there might be lots of other lobbyists, legislators, folks who have a lot of different competing interests at all of the kind of local walkable coffee shops, lunch spots, all of those things. And folks are a little bit on their guard and might not feel comfortable speaking as candidly as they might in the district about their priorities. It's really important that you call ahead and see whether they have any office hours going on. That's a time when you know the legislator is going to be primed. They might have them at a local coffee shop, a library, a community center. And that's a time when they're ready to hear from you. And you can take advantage of knowing for sure that they'll be there. As far as agendas go, I don't think that you necessarily need to have, especially if it's a meet and greet, a printed out agenda for a legislator in a meeting like this. But I do think it's important that you have your own mental agenda coming in as to what you want to cover and make sure that you hit all those points. And if the meeting's going really, really well and you feel comfortable and friendly, I recommend just taking a quick photo, asking them if they're okay with that, and you can post it on their social media and tag them. The other opportunity for engaging with legislators in the district that I wanted to cover is hosting a site visit. Site visits are one of my personal favorite activities as somebody who's been in the advocacy space for the last 15 years or so. The first thing you want to think about is what partners you might have out. And when we say site visit, we mean, do you run a child care facility? Have a legislator come out, do a tour, meet the children, meet your program staff, meet some parents. If you could have parents in the room, that would be fantastic. Perhaps this is something you want to bring in one of your local funders, or you're doing some programming across a different sector and you've got a local school district that does stuff with you. Have somebody from there come in. If you have a state legislator come in, maybe you want to consider inviting a city council member or a local mayor or county commissioner that day as well, since you know everything's going to be in tip-top shape. You want to make sure that you have multiple date options available when you call the state legislative office. Their committees are constantly changing. It's always good to have a backup plan. And if you can, try to do a little bit of research ahead of time and see when the session dates are on the ohiohouse.gov calendar, the ohiosenate.gov calendar. Typically Mondays and Fridays, most legislators will be back in the district. Session is usually Tuesdays and Wednesdays. Committees are often Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, but they could happen earlier in the week too. So it's good to just do a little bit of digging and try to find dates that you know are more likely to work. I also recommend making sure that you confirm that week, because the committee calendars do generally come out the Friday before each week. So if you call on Monday, their legislative aide is far more likely to know for sure whether or not they're going to be in the district that day. Plan an agenda and a role for everybody at these events. These are a little bit more formal than perhaps going to a community hours or having a coffee. You can print a formal agenda if you would like, but most importantly, having some roles for each person who's engaged in the conversation. Make sure you know who's going to be greeting the legislator at the door. It would be great if you could have, water or coffee, something minimal. It doesn't have to be fancy by any means, but have somebody in charge of that. Have somebody in charge of taking photos and confirm with the legislative staff that it's okay that you take photos and tag them. I tend to think that legislators love getting photos at these opportunities because it shows them working in the district and meeting with constituents. You will want to think about where you're going to have your conversation. So is it a walk and talk? Is it, do you have a conference room or a lobby or a meeting space where you could perhaps sit down and have a conversation setting the table before you walk around and see the programming? Or is that something you think would be better done at the end of the meeting? Do you want to start with the walkabout and then, once you've gotten their investment and they feel emotionally tied and logically tied to the great work that you're doing, maybe you have the sit down conversation at the end? Again, I just can't emphasize enough. The photos are really important. please send a thank you note after your site visit. It's okay if you're doing an email, that's fine. Handwritten notes are great too. And if you did grab some photos and you could send those over to their staff love posting those on their websites and social media pages. One more opportunity coming up this summer that Groundwork is providing is our Roadshow Listening Tour. That QR code will take you to the main page that our team has put together, listing 14 events around the state. We're doing listening sessions in urban and rural communities alike. The first event will be next week, Thursday, April 25th in Wilmington in Clinton County. Please, if you're in that region, we'd love to see you. We will be going through the end of June, if not the beginning of July. And you can see these little red dots all over our the spots that we have locations confirmed. There are a couple dates still outstanding. If you would like to be engaged, please feel free to shoot me an email or a text, and I'm happy to engage with you. All of the road shows are free for folks to register to attend, and we're going to have really great programming from folks that are focused on health equity and diversity issues in our hospital systems to folks who are providers of childcare, both center-based and family-based, parents, elected officials at the local level. At the end of this series of 14 events, we're putting together an agenda that will help inform our public policy approach coming into the upcoming budget cycle. So we really want to hear from you. If you can't attend in person, we'll have a survey, but we will also have the survey available via QR code at the events, and are really, really excited to talk about the opportunities and challenges that we're seeing at the local level for best serving. And Becca put a link in the chat because she's amazing for serving Ohio's youngest children. And at this point, I am going to turn it over to Daniel to talk a little bit more about power mapping your own network.
Thanks, Brittany. Yeah, so I think what I'm going to go through here, which is power mapping, and then kind of into social media and press. There's probably on the meeting today, probably various levels of comfort with all of these. So hopefully there's something for everyone. And I'm not telling you things you'll totally already know, but either way, afterwards, there'll be plenty of time for questions so we can dig in deeper on any of these items. But just to start off with, on power mapping, what does that really mean? It's identifying, who has influence, who you have access to that can help you accomplish your advocacy goals. So I'm going to go into that a bit. So starting out, kind of building relationships with policymakers at the state level. And really what that is, that's, members of the General Assembly, and, identifying relevant committees and members of leadership, the administration, who within the administration deals in issues that are important to you, and then other kind of health and human services stakeholders at the state level. But I think kind of what's most interesting and most relevant to most people who want to engage in advocacy is the local stuff. So if we could go to the next slide. And that's, as I said, the Statehouse delegation and the statewide connections and advocacy is incredibly important. It's critical, particularly in the issues in which we deal. But we can't lose sight of the local partners who we have connectivity to, and who also have a stake in our advocacy outcomes as well. And some of them make decisions at the local level and can be partners in our advocacy. And they can serve as third-party validators to what we're doing or help sway decision makers at the State House. And that's sort of forming the holistic part of a power map with tentacles. But going into a bit of who these people are, they're local government officials, mayors, city council, county commissioners, county executives, department heads from local JFS or health departments, any local government person who's dealing in what's important. Business leaders, just for example, the Chamber of Commerce has come out, the Ohio Chamber of Commerce, I'm not speaking on locally recently, but has really come out, in force about the importance of investing in childcare recently. So local chambers of commerce, or maybe a parent company, a franchise entity within your region. Third, religious leaders, they can be very motivational in building momentum among their congregations. Other civic organizations, there are people working in the systems that are necessary for kids to thrive, whether that's combating hunger, housing insecurity, maybe it's local school board members who also kind of fall into that local government official realm. And then media, which I'm going to get into after I talk about social media, but I'll get into media in a moment. Yeah, so we can go to the next slide. I'll start with that engaging in social media. I'm going to try to talk about some sort of best practices. So first, whenever possible, it's nice to plan out social media posts in advance. Obviously, you want to react to content and post content that you're going to get, but thinking about that, what that might be, drafting it is great. And if you have content is going to be relevant a couple days, a week, a month from now, you can plan parts of it in advance. And they're great tools to help you schedule content in advance. One is Hootsuite that I've used in the past. And it can just help kind of implement a calendar without having to react constantly. Next, if it makes sense and obviously with permission, sharing family success stories can obviously be incredibly impactful. And it helps personalize the policy issues and elevates the voices of the members of your community. You can also use social media as a tool for collaboration with partners and stakeholders. You could develop a day of action, for example, and what that would sort of look like is you would, bring folks together, organizations, and participating stakeholders, and agree on that day of a specific type of content within a specific period of time, whether that's all day or a few hours, that kind of helps flood people's feeds that day or during that time with your message. And it really helps get in front of, in sort of a repetitive way, your message and the messages that's shared with your allies on the issue. The last one, which, is hard for me to do sometimes, but be careful when being critical of policymakers. It's fine to express disappointment, but important to keep it cordial because ultimately they are making a lot of decisions that impact what we're advocating for. And just thinking about the long-term relationships and trusts, so that your policymaker at best sees you as trusted and credible resource, but does not see you as adversarial, because at least in my experience, that's almost always not productive. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So Twitter, or X, is the best platform for reaching policymakers, and Facebook is very useful as well. But there's opportunities on other platforms. LinkedIn is awesome for reaching business leaders and professionals within the community. It also happens to be the place where there's the least trolling and negativity. It tends to remain largely professional. So it's, I think, becoming an increasingly necessary place to be for certain messages. And Facebook is a great way to reach, parents and neighbors. And Twitter is a little bit more of the policymaker and reporter realm. So it's good to think about those segments, what your message is, the frequency of posting, all that. Tagging policymakers in your posts sounds obvious, but it's a very small step that a lot of people miss. And they or their staff it'll show up in their notifications, and that's a pretty direct way to get a message in front of them. Not to say they're going to read every notification they have, but as an advocacy organization or someone advocating on behalf of an issue, if you're taking the time to write to their office or call their office, this is just another touch point, and you never want to forget to tag them if it's possible. And then when it makes sense, link out to relevant resources, whether that's news clips or reports. Sharing images within your post often makes it perform better. And then, hashtags, as it says on here, increases the visibility. And just kind of taking these little steps can make a real difference in amplifying a social media channel from somewhat dormant and in an echo chamber to a little bit broader. go to the next slide, and I'm going to just talk lastly about press. So first, I'm going to talk about sort of an editorial strategy, and then I'll get into press itself, like the report dealing with reporters. So just in an overarching way, a great way to communicate your message is through the local media. Yes, there is less local media than there was, but it still is there, and it's still important. And people who are trying to influence do read it. I think that varies depending on where you are and what outlets are your local media, but increasingly important. And then you take for example, all of these policymakers have Google alerts set up with their name. So like if we're targeting someone or an issue, they'll see it. I mean, I'll give an anecdote that I've heard, and this is, we're not talking here about a local elected official, but Senator Sherrod Brown, and I'll get into letters to the editor in a moment, but I've heard from more than one person in the state of Ohio, there's probably people on this call who know this, is that he reads these letters to the editor across the state, and he's obviously like a voracious newspaper reader, and he's, consumed everything. And so I've heard from more than one person that when they wrote like a letter to editor on a specific issue advocating for something that didn't even mention Sherrod Brown, they got a handwritten note from him saying, "Hey, thanks for your piece in the Cleveland Plain Dealer. I read it." So that's an anecdote to say that I think that's pretty cool, but also to say that these are being monitored by the people who we want to impact. Not everyone, but it's a really, really good touch point. So to get into the editorial piece, either an op-ed or a letter to the editor. So I think most people know this, but a letter to the editor is typically like a shorter format, like 100 to 250 words. Anyone can write a letter to the editor. Usually the newspaper does require you to submit your address, and you need to live within their coverage area. But it's a forum for citizens. An op-ed is, just a longer form opinion piece, typically like 500 to 700 words, depending on the newspaper. And usually the barrier to entry to get an op-ed published is a little bit higher. Some sort of credential that is related to what you're writing on. You don't need to be the president of something, but, I think most of the people on this call, frankly, have the credential to write an op-ed. I'm just saying that is a slight difference between op-eds and letters to the editor. Timing for both is key. Whenever I'm thinking about op-eds or letters to the editor, it's okay, what's my issue? Sure. But what's been in the news recently that I could write something on to react to, or have a client write something on to react to. So that's another way to think about ways to work your message into the media, as I'm sure most or all of you do, is monitoring news media that's relevant to your issues. And if something pops and you're like, hey, I want to respond to that, or I want to piggyback off of that, or elaborate on it, that would be a really good opportunity to do an op-ed or a letter to the editor. To the point of timeliness too, I think there's another way of looking at it as even if something hasn't been in the press or hasn't been elevated and you want to elevate it, really working into that letter to the editor, or particularly op-ed, read a little more space of what is the real direct relevance to your local community. I think number one will make it more likely to get printed, and number two makes for a better piece.
Daniel, if I could interrupt you, we got a question, I think, really relevant to this component of our presentation. Sandra Toth asks, do you think traditional media may come back because of recent issues with social media?
So that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I like to hope so. I have no idea. What I do know that's really interesting to think about is for all of the, in my opinion, sort of negative impact that conglomerations and consolidation and lack of funding for no local newspapers has had, is there are some interesting models popping up around nonprofit newsrooms. Ohio Capital Journal is an example of one. The original sort of king of this, in my opinion. If anyone's aware of the Texas Tribune, that's been around at Austin, Texas forever. And it's, a nonprofit newsroom. And that is a model that I see hopefully expanding to some degree to sort of help fill the void. I think that like traditional newspapers are, they've been a decade plus long like battle to figure out how to stay alive. So how social media impacts that is, my prediction is yes, hopefully, but I don't know. I think the more relevant piece of that is like, think about it as like social media. It certainly has its problems, but it's still relevant. Local press certainly has gone through its issues, but it's still relevant. And this nonprofit newsroom model I see becoming more and more relevant.
Ohio Capital Journal has covered a ton around childcare specific issues. So it's a really salient example, I think. Sandra did have a follow-up. Thoughts on TV spots or ads? Obviously, there's significant costs there, maybe as compared to a letter to an editor or a tweet or some of the other tools we've talked about.
Yeah. So let me answer this in a few ways. I think number one, there's opportunity to get broadcast media coverage, whether it's, your local broadcast station, ABC, Fox, NBC, CBS, affiliates. Spectrum Ohio also has pretty significant coverage in certain places. So I think, I'm not going to get way into the weeds on it now, but as part of a strategy, like, and what I get into is like building relationships with reporters, getting to know a TV reporter, knowing when you might be able to get coverage on an event or an issue or to insert yourself into TV coverage. So that's organic, free, that's not, I don't think what the question was directed to, but I do think it's important. And like, people still watch broadcast television. I do on like Sunday night, but and then to piggyback on that, it's still the king of advertising. I think that's shifting into digital, CTV, YouTube, like a lot, but broadcast is still the place where a lot of most money is spent on a political campaign, for example. In terms of like paying for a TV spot on broadcast TV in the state of Ohio, I think as an organization, to make that sort of expenditure, you'd need like a very clear goal in mind, and an enormous amount of resources. But I mean, as a persuasion tool, if it can be done properly over time, it's still an excellent way to do it.
Thank you.
And there are cheaper, more cost-effective, more targeted ways to get in front of people through digital advertising. But again, I would encourage, as part of anyone's media strategy, to think about television as a really important place to try to get a clip and generate a TV story. I mean, Groundwork Ohio, for example, whether it's Lenan or Shannon Jones, Lenan Gutierrez or Shannon Jones have been on like local TV in Columbus often. I don't know if anyone knows Becca Thomas, but thanks to her, she's placed them on television, and it gets the word out. And like, I hear because people are like, oh yeah, hey, you work with Groundwork sometimes, or yeah, I saw this, on TV. I'm like, oh my gosh, I was not watching NBC this afternoon, but I guess you were. So that's a very long-winded answer, but hopefully it was helpful.
Well, I hear like sometimes just talking to legislators organically, a lot of them do still, thinking about our target audiences, a lot of them do consume that broadcast media still. They put it on when they're getting ready in the morning and driving down here. I think it's definitely still relevant.
Yeah, totally. And I think radio falls in that bucket too. I mean, I think thinking about this holistically is like, it's obviously not just newspaper. I mean, Ohio Capital Journal, which I just mentioned, is a nonprofit newsroom, as most nonprofit newsrooms are, is all online. So I think it's just important to think about it holistically and identify the opportunities you might have in your local area based on what exists, right? So like kind of piggybacking on that into the building relationships with relevant reporters piece of this is like, it's a research project, but it's kind of fun, right? It's like, you may already know some of it, but who are the people at your local newspaper or your local radio station, if you have one that focuses on news, or your local TV stations who cover issues related to the issue that you're trying to advocate for. And that's like a reporter's beat, right? So for small papers, some reporters, and actually at most small papers, almost every reporter will cover many beats. But like, we fit into one of them. And for larger papers, they may be assigned to a specific beat, like an education reporter, a business reporter, healthcare reporter. If you just go to their websites, they'll usually have like a directory. So that's a good way to figure out, okay, like in a lot of small papers, there'll be two reporters or one reporter and an editor. So you can figure it out and try to establish a relationship, and I can get into that in a second. TV is a little bit harder to figure out who's covering what and what's the beat. But any TV newsroom's email address is usually on their TV website, excuse me. So again, it's a research project to figure out, okay, who are the reporters? What are their contacts? So, and another way done is just going to the website. It's like Googling your issue, narrowing it down, figuring out who, Toledo Blade childcare. Okay, has someone reported on it? So
and I have to shout out Daniel because he's done a lot of that work for us as we're planning these roadshow events around the state. He already knows this. I feel like you just have it in your brain. The list that you send out as we're looking at different locations are so robust and across different types of media channels. So we really just appreciate your expertise in that space because
thank you. Yeah,
it's a lot of
there's
digging.
Other things that should be in my brain, but yes, that is occupying my brain. And then, I think the kind of more nuanced thing to all of this is like, okay, I keep saying like make a relationship with a reporter. Like, what does that mean, right? I think that like identifying like what issue you really care about, why you could be relevant to that reporter and what you have to say. I think a great way to like make an introduction is when there's something that you believe is newsworthy, that you would like to get into the press, whatever that may be, whether it's I think there's a problem in our local community, and here's what my group is doing to advocate to change it, to something like super specific. I can't define what that is, but using that as a way to like maybe email the reporter and suggest they cover it and say, if you're interested in talking to me about it, I can. I think every person, every organization has a different level of comfort with like reaching out directly to reporters on that. But speaking generally, that is how I would suggest making an initial introduction with a reporter if you haven't had it yet. I think another way to do it is in your orbit. If you have someone who may have worked with the press or something, is just to ask, hey, do you know this reporter? I really want to get on their radar because I think they might be interested in covering my issue. And then in terms of like how to kind of stay in touch, if let's say you make initial contact, you have a nice conversation. Hey, I may not have anything for you to cover now, but here's what I'm working on. I'll stay in touch. If they ever write a story that's even tangentially related to what you care about that you had spoken about, just sending them a note saying, hey, I read your piece. I thought it was really interesting. Like, let me know if I can ever connect with you to talk more about my issues. So it's like this soft skill, in my opinion, that can take time, but can pay dividends because it's really hard to do without having worked it. So I encourage everyone, if this is at all appealing to them, to sort of think about it, do the research, and dive in where it makes sense. That's it, I think. We can do questions.
Yeah, absolutely. We'd love to do questions. We've got a little bit more info on some upcoming opportunities to engage outside of the roadshow that we'll flash to you next. But I really want to thank Daniel for being here and spending part of his morning with us and his expertise, experiences, and tangible examples of how we can be our best advocates. And if folks have any questions, I think the Q&A function is the easiest way probably to submit something. But we do have a little bit of extra time and we're happy to chat more. Maybe you're all really busy on X tagging at Groundwork Ohio about all the new tips and tricks you have. And while you're thinking about questions, I will go ahead and share this last slide. We have two really exciting opportunities to engage. So this was our April webinar. We're doing a monthly series all year long in 2024, building momentum, building our advocacy muscles. And in May, my colleague Caitlin Fiesge is planning on May 10th at 11 a.m. It's a Friday. We will be having a webinar focused on early childhood mental health. All of these events are listed on our website. We just launched a new version of our website this week, which is absolutely beautiful and I think really easy to navigate. So please, these are all free to attend. We have, oh, and Becca is already ahead of the game and put the link in there to attend. And then the second thing I wanted to point out is this QR code for the rapid survey. Our team has partnered with Stanford University to put together this quick turnaround of a survey. It's also pretty quick to take, I think 15 minutes or less if you use this QR code. We just ask that respondents have either a child or our caregiver of a child in their home who's under age 6. Everyone who takes part in this survey opportunity will receive a $5 gift card. And there's a link to the rapid survey in the chat as well. Does Instagram have any relevant reach? We can go ahead and answer that one. I personally think Groundwork's quite active on Instagram. Some policymakers are there. Some of the younger policymakers I've seen even at the Statehouse doing like Instagram live stories of their session days and what that looks like. Daniel, I don't know if you have thoughts on like who are the target audiences on Instagram? Is it an age bracket? Is it a type of a consumer of that content?
Yeah, it's primarily an age bracket. I'd have to be, anyone could Google it. I'd have to look. I think I used to say it's young people, but now it's like not totally young people. But yeah, it's like, I think the most Instagram users are like 30 to 40.
Aging millennials.
But yeah, I mean, so to answer the question, is it a useful tool? Yes. I also think like within it, certain types of content like short video can do really well. So I would add it to your repertoire if you have the capacity to do so. The other thing about it is it's owned by Meta, which is the same as Facebook. So there's a lot of ability to cross post between the two. So as long as you're doing Facebook, it's kind of like you could just pretty easily do Instagram. So yeah, I think it's useful.
We have a couple more comments. Sharis, who's one of our Family Leadership Fellows in 2024 and has been on TV this year already, I've seen, is unable to come when we're in Portsmouth where she lives. Will this be a regular occasion? Let's keep chatting about that. This is the first year we're doing the robust roadshow tour, and we're really excited to see how it goes. We're hoping for great turnouts everywhere and lots of great media coverage and engagement with our policymakers, but would love to just keep talking about what that could look like as it evolves. I do think probably during the calendar years that are the operating budget years, that's the odd numbered years, we will be quite focused on Statehouse meetings as we're trying to cover all the finance committee hearings and all of those fun things. So that if we're going to be able to keep doing it, it'll probably be in those even numbered years. And then Sandra mentions talking points. Do we have talking points on our website? That's a great question. We have lots of different research published about discrete focus areas of our work. But if you would ever like to chat more with our team, I think, you know, if you're looking at a site visit and you want to have talking points about your own program and community, that's something that we would be happy to chat about. But where we can probably be most helpful, we have county by county fact sheets that might give you the data at kind of that more local level about programs and services and population outcomes in each community. Do policymakers, Matthew Miner would like to know, do policymakers really care about advocacy? Does it have an effect on voter turnout for them? Would you like to take this one, Daniel? It's a big philosophical question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, speaking about Daniel Van Hoogstraten and not Groundwork, Ohio, I think that like, in terms of voter turnout, I mean, the Statehouse is so gerrymandered that most members are pretty safe in safe seats, and the threat of election is probably not as healthy as it should be, if I'm being honest. That's not completely true. And I also think there are many, many very well-intended legislators who are impacted by advocacy because it amplifies the voices of what their constituents care about. So Yeah, I think it's impactful. I think it is not solely because of elections, particularly in the state of Ohio, in my opinion.
I can give an example. I think it feels like a long game and an uphill slog oftentimes to do advocacy work, but when I was a legislative aide and we were looking at a state operating budget, there were suggested cuts at that time from the governor's office around our library systems. And I remember vividly that we literally couldn't answer our phones anymore because our lines were just so completely flooded. Our inboxes were nonstop. And the legislator that I worked for did ask for, we couldn't even keep up with the totals on how many calls were coming in. And, when she would come in, she would say, what are people talking about? What are my constituents calling about? And the libraries, because they had such people power, they weren't spending it. Maybe they did spend some money on this campaign, but to me, that was a really moving example of how people could mobilize in a way that elected officials did notice.
That's great. Yeah.
And one of our attendees also, Sandra, mentions that they do care during an election year. Their attention spans, I think, change with the election cycles, probably on certain topics. Any more questions? I'll do a final call. We have a little bit of time left, but these have been really great questions. And it's been really fun for me to have this conversation with everyone. And again, our information is on the website. My contact info, Becca can put my email address in the chat if you are interested in reaching out about the roadshow specifically, or if you have any other questions about advocacy, happy to chat anytime. Wonderful. Any other thoughts, Daniel, before we depart?
No, thanks for having me, and thanks to everyone on for their time.
Thanks so much, everybody. I'm hoping I can meet some of the attendees in person at one of the roadshow events, and always happy to talk about tips and tricks for site visits and answer any questions. So thanks, everybody. Take care. Thanks, Daniel.